Good evening. Welcome. I'm Victor Curran, and it is my honor to welcome you here to, on behalf of the Transcendentalism Council of First Parish in Concord and our co-sponsors, the Concord Festival of Authors. Transcendentalism Council of First Parish in Concord, for over 15 years, we have been planning and presenting events like this that celebrate and educate about the women and men who made Concord the home of American imagination and independence. A couple of housekeeping things. There will be a Q&A at the end of Megan's presentation. If you are joining us on Zoom, just use the chat button at the bottom of your screen to type your question. After the Q&A, there will be a reception downstairs in the parish hall. You can reach the parish hall through these doors or through the doors in the vestibule, and then come to this end of the building. Anyone who would like to use an elevator, through those doors to your right is an elevator, and that will also take you down to the parish hall. In addition to the reception, we will also have Megan's books available for sale and signing. Megan Marshall is the Charles Wesley Emerson Professor at Emerson College, where she was her first biography, The Peabody Sisters, Three Women Who Ignited American Romanticism, published in 2005, won the Francis Parkman Prize, the Mark Linton History Prize, the Massachusetts Book Award, and was a finalist for the Pulitzer Prize in Biography and Memoir. Her second biography, Margaret Fuller, A New American Life, published in 2013, won the Pulitzer for Biography in 2014. Also won the Massachusetts Book Award in Nonfiction. Her third biography, Elizabeth Bishop, A Miracle for Breakfast, that's 2017. That was a finalist for the Phi Beta Kappa Society's Christian Gauss Award in Literary Scholarship. In 2022, Megan Marshall received the Bio Award, the highest honor given by the Biographers International Organization, and the Thoreau Society's Walter Harding Distinguished Service Award for contribution to the study of American Transcendentalism. In her most recent book, After Lives, she turns her narrative gift to her own art and life and the people in it. In each of 6 essays, she reinvents the personal essay form as a portal to the past and its lessons for living into the future. Now, this is a little bit more personal moment for me than mostly when I get up here to introduce one of our lecturers, because when we had the celebration of Margaret Fuller's 200 years of Margaret Fuller's birth here at First Parish, Diane Weiss introduced me to Megan Marshall. This was before her Margaret Fuller biography was published, but she was already widely recognized for her Margaret Fuller scholarship. And 11 years ago, Megan joined us in this sanctuary when Diane Weiss and I were married. She has spoken here for the Transcendentalism Council and many other Concord venues, and it is a deeply personal pleasure to welcome her back.
Thank you, Victor, for that wonderful introduction, and I'm missing Diane too. Thank you, Shelley Hawks, as well, for setting everything up, and Arkady for doing the slides. I'm going to be now and then saying next, but not yet. That wasn't a real next. So I hope that will work out and not be too interruptive of my talk. I'm going to start by reading something that I have just written. There's an initiative through the Harvard Divinity School's Center for World Religions to consider the question, Transcendentalism Now. How can we revive this movement? Should we revive this movement? How can it be meaningful now? And I was asked to contribute a short essay for their website in this initiative, and it's just gone up. Mine was the third in a series, and the previous ones were addressed, I think, more to, I don't know, what we think of often as transcendentalism, kind of the meditative qualities and kind of centering ourselves in this difficult time. And I took a different route, and what I ended up writing felt to me more like a speech or a sermon, I guess. So I thought I would read it to you and see, because it is kind of my latest thinking about both Fuller and Peabody, Elizabeth Peabody. And I meant to also say thank you so much for being here when in this year, this Margaret Fuller, the Library of America volume of her collected works edited by me, but also two others, Bridget Bailey, Briggs Bailey, and Noel Baker. It's kind of a culmination of my work on Fuller, and then it dawned on me that it had been 20 years since I published the Peabody Sisters. You can see I've done a lot of things with it since, and it took me 20 years to write it, so that's kind of a double, that's a 40 years you see there. Anyway, so here's my transcendental sermon, which is also a little bit of a personal essay, called Practicing Transcendentalism. I also want to apologize that it's largely set in Salem, not Concord, but anyway. On a recent Friday in late September, unseasonably warm, as so many New England days are now, I drove up to Salem for the premiere of my friend Scott Wheeler's trio for violin, cello, and harp called Insomnia Flowers. The music was glorious in Samuel McIntyre's stately Hamilton Hall, reverberant in the audience members' collective body heat, sealed in as we were by storm windows already in place. Leery of an hour-long drive home in the dark, I stayed over in a hotel on the harbor and woke early the next day to walk Salem's streets before the pre-Halloween Saturday throngs of eerily clad revelers overtook them and the temperature began to rise again. Inexorably, I was drawn to Howard Street Cemetery, hard by the Salem jail, the oldest active penitentiary in the country at the time of its closing in 1991, after nearly 200 years. Not for nothing had Nathaniel Hawthorne written in the opening pages of the Scarlet Letter, composed 2 blocks away in 1849, "The founders of a new colony, whatever utopia of human virtue and happiness they might originally project, have invariably recognized it among their earliest practical necessities to allot a portion of the virgin soil as a cemetery and another as the site of a prison." When I first visited Howard Street Cemetery, there were still prisoners housed next door. I was hunting for the grave of Elizabeth Palmer Peabody, known as Eliza, the mother of the 3 Peabody sisters, whose lives I researched and wrote about from 1985 until the completion of my book in 2005. When Eliza Peabody died in 1853, I'd read in letters from the time, her surviving children planned to bury her at Harmony Grove, Salem's new garden cemetery overlooking the city, a fitting tribute for the matriarch who'd raised such influential daughters. By then, Sophia and Mary were married to Nathaniel Hawthorne and Horace Mann. Elizabeth, the eldest and her mother's namesake, was closing up her famous bookshop, the Caravansary to the Transcendentalists, at 13 West Street in Boston, and contemplating her next moves. But there was no trace of Eliza in Harmony Grove's register. Salem's town records finally revealed that she'd been buried at Howard Street alongside her youngest child, Catherine, dead at 7 weeks in 1819, and 2 adult sons, Wellington and George, who died in their 20s. Eliza's stone was the most worn of the 3. Catherine had her own slate marker. The brothers shared a narrow marble slab. And even in the sparsely populated burial ground, it was difficult to find her. On that first visit, I felt sad that the sisters hadn't managed to raise the funds to honor their mother as they'd wished, and I imagined disappointment mingling with feelings of loss at the burial. But that, too, seemed fitting for the impecunious family. Even the celebrated husbands never earned much. I think we can have the next slide here. In September 2025, I approach the cemetery from Bridge Street and climb a low hill leading up to the playing field-sized burial ground. The morning sun blazes over the rooftops of neighboring houses to the east and through the branches of a few tall trees that offer little shade. It's hardly 9 a.m. and I'm hot already in shorts and a t-shirt. The grass is patchy and sere, not because it's fall, but because of drought and record high temperatures through the summer. I look toward the far end of the cemetery. Let's change the slide, go to the next slide, where I know I'll hunt and nearly give up and then finally find the gravestones I'm searching for. And I'm in tears. What was the use? What was the use on our burning planet, in our plundered democracy, of the sacrifice and struggle that brought three sisters into the world when the country was new, who dared to say to one another, as Elizabeth Peabody wrote of her transcendentalist comrades, why not begin to move the mountain of custom and convention? What use my labor in retelling their lives? What use can we make of transcendentalism now? Can reawakening their movement ease the despair we feel at having allowed the transcendentalists' hopes for a more interior revolution that would give life to those forms of freedom that Washington and his friends left to us, as Peabody predicted in an 1829 letter to William Wordsworth, to go unfulfilled? In our own lifetimes, we have given much. Yet, as Yale historian David Blight remarked in a recent Authors Guild program on the future of the historical profession in the United States, the explosion of groundbreaking research and writing of the past 50 years, set off by the liberation movements of the 1960s and 70s, faces extinction. We were not prepared to defend it, Blight said. We must prepare, we must defend. Above all, we must move forward with our work, shape it to the moment if we feel called to do so, despite intimidation and funding cuts and loss of employment, despite the rising tides of cruelty and know-nothingism into which we write. I turn my thoughts away from the pressing issue of our scattered attention in the eyes of social media, in the era of social media, toward action. And I take my cue from the women of the movement. Not for them, Emerson's question, quoted in the latest essay in this series, what is life but what a man is thinking all day? And not only because the question, as stated, explicitly excluded women. Transcendentalism's women were doers. Their language called for action. Proposing her first series of conversations for adult women in 1839, Margaret Fuller asked instead, could a circle be assembled in earnest, desirous to answer the great questions? What were we born to do? How shall we do it? Which so few ever propose to themselves till their best years are gone by. Fuller would be the moving spring of her ambitious project. The year before, in 1838, while teaching history to a class of adult women in Salem, Elizabeth Peabody had resolved to be myself and act. In advance of Fuller, she led her students to discover the necessity of trying to do something ourselves. Cultivating an inward life, thinking all day, wasn't enough. The measure of our life is our power, Peabody wrote. And she followed through on her vow. In 1840, Peabody opened the foreign language bookstore and subscription library on West Street, not only to engage in intellectual commerce, but also to establish a gathering place where she could arrange all whom I know around me as my leaves and fruit. Fuller held classes there. Sophia and George Ripley's Brook Farm communitarians met there for planning sessions. Peabody's Wednesday night open houses at 13 West Street continued for years. Elizabeth Peabody had been acting all along, teaching in an innovative Socratic style from age 17 in 1821, translating and publishing key texts, including Di Gerondo's Self-Education, a favorite with the Transcendentalists, writing up her own ideas and finding outlets for them. One of these ideas was her proposal that in a democracy, the federal government should fund creative artists, a policy finally adopted in 1965 with the creation of the National Endowment for the Arts, and largely abandoned by Donald Trump in 2025. Another was the social principle, originated by Peabody in an essay drafted in 1825, eventually published in the Christian Examiner in 1834, and the topic of Transcendental Club discussion in Peabody's bookroom in September 1840. The social principle was Peabody's transcendentalism. It is the very principle of our nature, Peabody wrote, that principle which is capable of being God within us. All of us possess, she continued, a spring of emotion deeper than the emotions of beauty and sublimity. This innate sympathy impels us toward reciprocal caregiving, making our social relations a miniature of the spiritual universe. No wonder Peabody's most significant contributions to the Dial as a writer were essays on Brook Farm. In 1835, the year Elizabeth Peabody published her transcriptions and commentary on Bronson Alcott's Temple School Dialogues, Record of a School, the first book-length exposition of transcendentalist views. This is Peabody's, not Waldo's. Elizabeth told her sister Mary, recently returned from 16 months in Cuba as a governess, that she, Elizabeth, was the only practical transcendentalist there is. Mary wasn't quite clear about the transcendental yet, she wrote to Horace Mann, reporting the conversation, and Elizabeth's claim to practicality didn't help her much. But I suspect Elizabeth was referring to the social principle. The recognition of our personal identity, she'd written in her essay, this self-reverence we acquire once we understand ourselves to be creatures of a loving God and members of an interdependent social circle, enables our power of choosing what to think, how to behave toward others, how to act. The measure of our life is our power. Peabody's good works went beyond the West Street bookshop and stretched late into the century with the founding of kindergartens nationwide and her advocacy alongside the Paiute leader Sarah Winnemucca to establish a tribal school rather than consign Paiute children to the US government's brutal and deracinating boarding schools. Margaret Fuller left Boston to become a pioneer of advocacy journalism in New York City, to join a revolution in Rome. Theirs was a practical, practicing transcendentalism from which we can take inspiration. Peabody and Fuller remind us to exercise our power of choosing. What are we to do? How shall we do it? Each of us will have our own answers. The title of my friend Scott Wheeler's trio for violin, cello, and harp, Insomnia Flowers, sums up his composition practice. Musical themes come to him in the night and keep him awake until he can jot them down. In the morning, in revision, they flower. May the worries that disturb our sleep tonight take shape in action tomorrow. In Salem, I dry my tears and contemplate the headstones of Eliza Peabody and her 3 children whose deaths she'd mourned. Here, at Howard Street, she's among souls she brought into the world and served, amid what her son-in-law Nathaniel Hawthorne called society's practical necessities, the cemetery and prison. Better this than to have been laid to rest beyond the exigencies of family and community life in the upper reaches of Harmony Grove. The utopia of human virtue and happiness Nathaniel Hawthorne fantasized is too far off. Or is it? The poet Rosanna Warren, whose father, Robert Penn Warren's classic novel, All the King's Men, warns us against demagogues, wrote to me recently of her determination to act freely in a time of unfreedom. Margaret Fuller envisioned her heavenly reward as empowering me to incessant acts of vigorous beauty. If action is heaven, we can make heaven here on earth. What could be more transcendent? That's my sermon. I'm not going to end my talk, but we could appreciate the sermon if you want. Thank you. Thank you. I just feel we have to speak up while we can, while we still can. So now I'm going to go through some slides that represent important aspects of these two books. Let's have the next slide. This is, sorry, I missed Elizabeth Peabody. I forgot to say, we were supposed to be looking at her through, as I was talking about the social principle. There's Elizabeth Peabody, a image that's at the Concord Free Library Special Collections. Later in life. So the next slide, we're going to get to Margaret Fuller. There are very few images of Fuller from her time. People have reimagined her since. This is a daguerreotype that was taken before she left to go to Rome. The cover image here is one of the few others, the Thomas Hicks portrait done in Rome, probably while she was pregnant with her son, Angelino, in secrecy, but you can, when you look at it, you'll see she looks full-bodied and a little tired, the way you do when you're pregnant. It's important to know that that portrait is in the National Portrait Gallery of the Smithsonian in Washington, D.C., the very gallery that's probably going to be rearranged so that there may no longer be a room devoted to radical people like Fuller and Douglass and Garrison of the 19th century. I hope that won't be changed. David Blight is still on the board there, and I think he can speak up. But if you're in Washington, go see Margaret Fuller's portrait in the National Portrait Gallery. In this book, there's so much. There's her full books. There are selections of letters. There's unpublished writing. There's a selection of her magazine journalism. So much. But I'm going to focus on a few aspects of it. I mentioned my composer friend, Scott Wheeler. He is reading through this book, which I'm very grateful for. He's not really a transcendentalism scholar, but he's just reading through it. And he's very caught by the poetry, which we decided, many of the transcendentalists wrote a great deal of poetry. Few of them published books of poetry, but their poetry kind of exists in their other works. That's true of Fuller, or in their journals, or in their letters, and that's how it's presented here. But we have an index at the back if you want to look for poems. So the next slide shows you this image, which Fuller referred to as a double triangle serpent and rays. It's something that she sketched in her own journal and wrote a poem that I'm going to read to you, if I can find it, called, well, it doesn't actually have any title, but its symbol is the Ouroboros, this snake that's sort of devouring itself, but it's a symbol of eternity, as is this, then we have the sun and we have the star, and I'm going to read this poem, which is presented in the book as it was in a journal, with the drawing, but this, what you're looking at now is a professionally rendered version of her sketch that served as the frontispiece to Woman in the 19th Century. So it's also reproduced as an illustration for that book in this book. But here's her poem, which I also think speaks to our moment. Patient serpent, circle round, till in death thy life is found. Double form of godly prime, holding the whole thought of time. When the perfect two embrace, male and female, black and white, soul is justified in space, dark made fruitful by the light. and centered in the diamond sun, time, eternity are one. Now, one of the things I promised to talk about here are some discoveries I made along the way in writing my books. And going to the next slide, I was very lucky to meet one of the descendants of Margaret Fuller's brothers, Lucilla Marvel, who happened to, she said, would you be interested to see some engravings that she had that had survived the shipwreck that Margaret Fuller was bringing back from Rome? And this is one of them. It's a image of Tasso's Oak, which is on the Janiculum Hill above Rome, and you can, I hope you can see it. What I'm looking at is very tiny from over here, but I hope you can see the Rome in the background. And we've used that also as an illustration in this book. It's in also my Fuller biography. And Tasso's Oak actually was standing until fairly recently when, I don't know whether it was a fire or a lightning strike. It's not there anymore, but she could visit it, and it was there when Tasso was, I think, imprisoned up there. I don't know the whole story. Somebody here probably does, but it's important partly because Fuller had visited this spot, but she had also, one of the ways that she connected with Ralph Waldo Emerson early on was by translating Goethe's play Torquato Tasso. So she was quite familiar with that play and Goethe's fascination with it, and it's a meaningful image. The next image, which is not reproduced in either my book or, I don't think, or this volume, but she was bringing it with her, Michelangelo's cypresses, which I figured out where these were, but whether the cypresses are still there, I don't know. But in any case, I like the two figures that are a little bit huddled in the foreground because it seems to represent maybe Fuller and Asoli in their secret meetings as they were falling in love. All right, let's look at the next slide too. This is just to give you a sense of her Rome, and I like this, this is the Piazza Barberini, which is now, lots of traffic, and we'll see another slide of it. She was staying in a building that's sort of catty-corner to the palazzo you're looking at there, the Palazzo Barberini. This is the Triton Fountain, and although it's very empty now, and perhaps, I don't know, that was because the photographer managed to get the traffic to slow down, but it also, when she was living in this building was during the siege of Rome, and it very likely was a kind of empty space at that time, so I think it's evocative of that 1848 to 9 year that she was covering the revolution. We'll go to another slide. I took my own trip to Rome, and some of you have traveled with Jenny Rankin to Rome to look at Margaret Fuller's sites. I want to say hi to Jenny, if she's listening. And here you see the sort of the building that's kind of mostly at the center of this is where Margaret Fuller was staying when she met Giovanni Asoli, and he would have stopped in to pick her up to go for some walks before she was staying there with the family that she was traveling with at the time, and then they split off and she came back to Rome and was living in that house that we're going to see next. But first, the next slide is of the baptismal font in the little town of Rieti, above about 40 miles from Rome, where Margaret Fuller hid out through her pregnancy and gave birth to little Nino. And I think it's, to me, very moving to see this actual place. There's so little actually known about the romance of Fuller and Asoli and whether they married or not, but the baptismal records were found, and it's there that they declared themselves to have been married, so we know that they at least wanted to be seen as married. And so maybe you can kind of visualize the couple and their baby, and whoever man of the cloth is baptizing little Nino. The next slide shows you the building that was catty corner to the Palazzo Barberini where she was staying. And now there's, or at least, sorry, then there was also a fountain right at the corner of that building, the Fountain of the Bees, which has been moved up through this square to a different location, but that was part of her life there. And I believe she was on the top floor, and that's where she wrote much of her Roman journal, observing as the troops descended to, reinstall the Pope and end that first wave of the Risorgimento, in which she was cared for wounded soldiers and wrote about it, and ultimately it was a failed revolution then. The next slide, a little cheerier, talking about discoveries. This was not my discovery, but Peter Drummey, the head librarian at the Massachusetts Historical Society, discovered in a room full of papers that belonged to the family descendants of James Freeman Clarke this letter case. And he thought, this letter case is so beautiful, there's got to be something wonderful in it. And what was in it were James Freeman Clarke's collection of letters he'd received from Margaret Fuller. This discovery was made probably in the early 1980s, and the letters of Margaret Fuller were in the process of being published. These letters had been kind of bowdlerized, cut up, and put into the first biography of Fuller, which was called Memoirs of Margaret Fuller, solely, I guess, by Ralph Waldo Emerson, William Henry Channing, and James Freeman Clarke. And so portions of the letters were known, but these full letters were a great discovery, and now the last volume of the full Margaret Fuller's letters is full of these full letters that had been presented only in truncated form in the earlier volumes. So I'm just very pleased to have some of these full letters in this book, and I'm going to show you, next slide. This is a letter from Margaret Fuller to James Freeman Clarke that I hope I have marked so I can read just a little bit from it. It's you probably can't make out the writing too much at all there, but it's dated April 19, 1836. And she's writing to him about Goethe. We know that she had translated Torquato Tasso around this time and was very fascinated with his life and had contemplated, for quite a while actually, hoped to write a biography of Goethe, great inspiration to the Transcendentalists. And but so she's starting to find out some kind of disturbing things about him, and as a woman, is it proper for her to learn about this? She's determined to know all that she can, but she's kind of shaken by this discovery. His novels could be racy, but she thought they were just novels. So she says to James Freeman Clarke, who was then still in divinity school, and they were about the same age, and he was able to study and become a minister. She couldn't do that, as you know, but they had studied German and read Goethe together. So she says, in a brief but seemingly calm and authentic notice of Goethe's life, which I met with in an English publication the other day, I find it stated that his son was illegitimate, that he lived out of wedlock with the mother for 20 years, and only married her on account of the son as late as 1806. I confess this has greatly pained and troubled me. Here she's writing this at age 26. I had no idea that the mighty indifferentist, that's Goethe, went so far with his experimentalizing in real life. I had not supposed he was all he writ. It's quite interesting to cast forward to Fuller's own life with an illegitimate child, conceived living with someone to whom she wasn't married, may not have been married. She writes to Clarke, I apply to you without scruple. These are subjects on which gentlemen and ladies usually talk a great deal, but apart from one another. You, however, are well aware that I am very destitute of what is commonly called modesty. When that blush does not come naturally into my face, I do not drop a veil to make people think it is there. All this may be very unlovely, but it is I. So there's a letter. Now I'm going to shift over for a few minutes to the Peabody sisters and my work on them. The next slide, here are some discoveries. Horace Mann and Mary Mann went out to Antioch College, and they were the first, he was the first president there, and there's a trove of amazing things there, including these silhouettes. This is Sophia Hawthorne and Nathaniel Hawthorne in silhouette around the time of their marriage. And the next slide is Horace Mann and Mary Mann in similar silhouettes, probably done in Boston. I don't really know how they ended up at Antioch, but that's where they are. And then a letter here, which is, go to the next slide. This was a letter I read at the Mass Historical Society, and I'm going to read just a little bit about it because, you know, you can see this is one of these cross-written letters, and you always know when they do that, they're going to write something interesting. And I'm kind of focusing on this what I'm speaking about, the Peabody family, these the kind of love triangles that emerged. It's not the whole story, but it makes the whole story spicier. So Mary and Elizabeth were living in a boarding house in Boston, and Horace Mann moved in. He was recently widowed, and they both kind of fell for him in their different ways. And Mary was the middle sister, kind of more stepping back from things, and her sister Elizabeth much more rushing in to claim a connection. And then Mary went off to Cuba with her sister Sophia, and leaving Elizabeth and Horace Mann in the boarding house for a while. What would happen? And Elizabeth kept writing to Mary about conversations and combing his hair and him sobbing in her arms, and what was Mary to think? So here's a passage, though, that so Mary apparently writes to Elizabeth saying, well, I'll just pick up from here. Still, Mary's questions in her letters about whether Horace Mann's visits might be misunderstood ultimately prompted Elizabeth to take up the matter with Mann himself. And for once, Mary must have been grateful for her sister's forthright nature. It had now been almost a year since Mary left for Cuba, a year of growing alarm over her sister's attachment to the man Mary privately thought of as my husband. They would ultimately marry, but not for 10 years after the point at which they had met. Mary could only have felt relief when she read the postscript Elizabeth scrawled across the closing lines of one of her journal letters in September 1834, telling of an evening spent discussing the difference between love and friendship with Horace Mann. The conversation had been perfectly unembarrassed and pleasant, and by the end, Elizabeth wrote, she felt certain that no misunderstanding can ever come between us, however affectionate we may be. While Mann had assured Elizabeth that my friendship is a great comfort to him, and he needs its constant ministrations, she was certain that it is a brother's and sister's love on both sides, and now I know he will never think otherwise. Elizabeth had broached the subject, she explained to Mary, because she wanted to be sure that he would never feel that I felt more than friendship for him, and he would feel no qualms about receiving my kind offices. She did not want Horace Mann to think that their growing intimacy required him to steer the relationship toward marriage. Not that it would not be possible for Mr. M to make me love him exclusively, she wrote, but I could not do it unless he had or did try for it. And his situation, his gray hairs, he was sort of famous that his hair turned white or gray within months of the death of his wife, and he still was pretty young. His gray hairs and his sorrow has ever precluded from my imagination that possibility. She recalled Lyman Buckminster's pursuit of her. She did have a suitor when she was young, and she turned him aside, and that's a whole other story. He killed himself. She recalled Lyman Buckminster's pursuit of her 10 years before, saying, I know what the feeling of love is, for I have been sought and all but won. This early experience left Elizabeth convinced now, she assured Mary, that strong as my friendship is, deep as my interest is in Mr. M, it is a totally different feeling. Elizabeth concealed disappointment in these words. This conversation could well have prompted Horace Mann to try for it if he had felt more than a brother's love for Elizabeth. There was a defensiveness in her list of Mann's flaws as a romantic prospect, his gray hair and his despondency. Just a month earlier, Elizabeth had written Mary that when she received a letter from Horace Mann apologizing for missing a Sunday night visit because he was out of town, signed yours very affectionately, H.M., she had actually kissed those sweet words. But as for Horace Mann, Elizabeth wrote, I'm quite sure he never felt more happy about the friendship than he did last night. And why not? Elizabeth had just invited him to carry on a relationship that offered more of the intimacies of marriage than any friendship he could have formed with a more conventional woman. Disappointed as she may have been, Elizabeth had won Mann's commitment to a more comradely relationship than any marriage she had yet to observe or to envision for herself. So there's the Horace Mann, Mary Peabody, Elizabeth Peabody triangle. Let's look at the next slide. Here you see Elizabeth, this is a set of family silhouettes that must have been cut out and then pasted all onto one piece of paper, and Elizabeth is the one holding up a book. You can see some of the brothers who died young, the parents, Sophia and Mary, and this is at the collections of what was the Essex Institute, Peabody Essex, whatever it is now. I gather there's a beautiful new archival place outside of Salem where you can see everything that they have, the witch trial records and the Hawthorne papers and everything. But I did my research when it was still right in Salem in the beautiful library there. Anyhow, we're going to look at the next slide, which is the house next to the burial ground where the hanging Judge Hawthorne is buried, and this is where the Peabodys were living on Charter Street when Nathaniel Hawthorne came to call. And look at it's now being renovated by a family named Peabody, who were not all that closely related to our Peabody sisters, but they have held this house and prevented it from being taken down. If you were to stand behind the Peabody Essex Museum and look across the street, there it is. And on one side there's a parking lot and a bank, and the other side is the cemetery. And it's really the only house like this around. And they have reproduced the doorway, which was taken off maybe 100 years ago and put on the back of that Essex Institute building. So now it's got the beautiful doorway that was there when Nathaniel Hawthorne entered with his two sisters, and Elizabeth declared to Sophia, who was upstairs too sick to come down, he's handsomer than Lord Byron. And he was. I don't have a slide of him, though. And we'll just look at the next slide. This is the first one was before they had painted the front, so it's really quite extraordinary there. So anyway, you can imagine that this is where this historic meeting took place. And one of my great discoveries working on the Peabody sisters was a manuscript biography of Elizabeth Peabody by one of her kindergarten disciples. And it was a long piece of writing in which she had copied out passages from journals and letters that really don't exist in any other way. These are journals of Elizabeth's stay with Ralph Waldo Emerson around the time that little Waldo was born, around the time of he was working on the Divinity School address to put it into print. And it also records her feelings in ways that are not otherwise found about this triangle of, because I think she really was in love with Nathaniel Hawthorne. I'm not sure so much about Horace Mann. And there was a period of time where, several months during which Nathaniel had not met Sophia, and Elizabeth and Nathaniel were taking walks and spending time together, and according to this manuscript biography, there had been an understanding that they would marry. But then Sophia came downstairs one day, and Elizabeth could see it was love at first sight in that case, and she withdrew to help her younger brother, Nat, teach a school in Newton Corner, which happened to be where I was living the whole time I was writing this book, so that was kind of interesting. So I'm just going to read a little passage, and that will be the end of my talk about this summer after the meeting. So Nathaniel Hawthorne came in to visit in November 1837. Around March is when Sophia came downstairs finally, and April or so, Elizabeth left, and Nathaniel Hawthorne also went off on one of his rambles. So this takes place at this point, and just thanks for listening to this. This is the passage I always love to read, but I haven't had occasion to read it for quite a while, so it's not too long. As soon as Nathaniel Hawthorne left Salem, Elizabeth began to hint that she'd like to come home. She complained to Sophia that in spite of all she had done for their brother Nat, finding him a house with an ample schoolroom, supplying him with pupils, teaching part of every day, he appeared utterly indifferent to her efforts. He seemed to believe, Elizabeth wrote in exasperation, that she had come merely to gratify my own willfulness, rather than to set him up in life. On Elizabeth's single visit home in early July, Mrs. Peabody noticed that her oldest daughter looked unhappy and ominously thin. She encouraged her to move back home, but Elizabeth was undecided. She had no real work to do in Salem, and she was intellectually out of step there. She had begun to feel, she confided in her mother, as if she was of no use and had no place to go. This just precedes those passages I read in my little sermon about her determination to act. Much of Elizabeth's uncertainty had to do with her increasingly tense relations with Sophia. She was no longer certain she was welcome at home. To test the waters, Elizabeth wrote Sophia that she had entered a period of self-examination. After 3 months of Nat's silent treatment, she had concluded that integrity was more important than charity. She hoped to find a way to live in more honest communication with others. This is very much a transcendentalist ideal. But Sophia misunderstood. Like Mary, Sophia tended to see Elizabeth as overbearing, inclined to push her younger siblings into ambitious and ill-conceived projects. Just that spring, Elizabeth had written from Newton Corner, asking Sophia to produce more of her watercolors to decorate Nat's house and schoolroom, to which Sophia, fully occupied with the romance unfolding in her parlor, had responded with horror. "It makes one faint to think of it. Do not suggest any plans to me. I do not want anything expected of me." This is an ongoing trial for Sophia, her great artistic talent, but did she want to really go for being an artist? Did she want a profession, or did she want to marry Nathaniel Hawthorne? What's more, Sophia often squirmed inwardly when Elizabeth dominated conversations with guests, especially, of course, important guests like Nathaniel Hawthorne. She was tired of listening to Elizabeth over-dramatize or stretch the truth to suit her own ends. Sophia thought Elizabeth was admitting now to a lack of personal honesty, to the tendency to exaggerate and overwhelm that, Sophia wrote back, had long ago destroyed your influence over me. Sophia welcomed Elizabeth home to our very heart of hearts, now that she was willing to admit her faults and attempt to correct them. "I shall never be satisfied without you at my side," Sophia wrote, but she asked Elizabeth to promise not even to mention my drawing and to allow her to follow the dictates of my mind. Elizabeth was livid. She blasted Sophia as she had Mary in the past. "I do not tell lies, but the truth, as it appears to me," she defended herself. An exaggeration in words sometimes conveys an idea much more completely than literal exactness. She despaired over Sophia's lack of confidence in her, but stubbornly refused to change, assuring her sister that "you will find me going on just the same as ever." And, she railed, I love this, "conversation is hacked down to concentrated mediocrity when polite speech matters more than full self-expression." Sophia's letter only pushed Elizabeth to make a more passionate statement of her views. I feel, as I never felt before, that to be true to one's self is the first thing, she wrote, that to sacrifice the perfect culture of my mind to social duties is not the thing, that one's inward instinct is one's best guide. Very transcendental. The argument about whose sense of veracity was most genuine, about Sophia's need to follow the dictates of my mind, and Elizabeth's desire to let her own inward instinct serve as her guide, was as close as either sister would come to acknowledging the summer-long tussle over Nathaniel Hawthorne. Struggling to accommodate herself to the almost certain loss of the future that she had let herself imagine with Hawthorne, Elizabeth told Sophia, as she had written to Mary in Cuba, that she had made a mistake in not insisting on a room to myself. I love this, 100 years before Virginia Woolf, she's talking about a room to myself. When the whole family had lived together in Boston 10 years earlier, she might then have been able to devote more time to her own interests, keep her volatile emotions in check, and in the end, make a success of the venture. It is better, she concluded now, to be called selfish and old-maidish than to lose one's own soul. Or to lose one's heart, she might also have said, if being truly honest with Sophia, even in her journal, in which she now had little heart to write, Elizabeth could speak only obliquely of the hurt she felt over Nathaniel Hawthorne's withdrawal of affection. Dissolution is painful when attraction of cohesion ceases, she wrote. In the end, Elizabeth took her August vacation with the Emersons in Concord on the way home to Salem, immersing herself in the controversy touched off by Waldo's Divinity School address and hoping to receive a friendlier letter from Sophia before her return. After all, it was Sophia who was winning this particular battle. So, 2 last slides, just my own documents. This is the menu from Cornucopia Restaurant, which was the great French restaurant in 13 West Street, the home of Elizabeth Peabody's bookstore. At the time that I signed the contract to write this book in 1984, I signed the contract, started writing in 1985, and I saved this. My publisher was Houghton Mifflin, which then had a lovely old office on 2 Park Street next to the Park Street Church. And this restaurant, so I had lunch with my editor, Roby McCauley, who died in 1995, was the first of my editors, a very brilliant man who told me a lot. And the last slide, you'll see that this restaurant is a little bit stretched out, but they honored the Peabody heritage in that building, and this is a description of all that went on there. And I like that they got the quotation right about the caravansary. Nathaniel Hawthorne referred to Mrs. Peabody's caravansary. He didn't identify it as Elizabeth Peabody's, but it was, Mrs. Peabody was still there. Eliza, the person whose grave I was searching for when we started this talk. So that's my talk. Thank you for hanging in with me. And I took up most of the hour, but we still have time for some questions, if you have questions.
If you do have a question, please let me get the microphone to you so that people who are watching us on Zoom will also hear your voice.
I've stunned you into silence.
Oh, yeah. Here's one.
But it still needs to go through for the virtual audience. It gets piped in.
I was just interested in your personal attraction between Margaret Fuller and the 3 Peabody sisters. Do you have a particular affinity or sense of closeness or interest?
That's an interesting question. People, when the Peabody sisters came out, they would often ask, did I have a favorite of the sisters? And I really don't. It was actually a great boon to be spending as much time as I did. If one of them began to frustrate me, there would always be another one I could turn to. the way I can answer that question about Fuller versus the Peabodys is that when I started writing the Peabody sisters in 1984 and 5, there had been several quite important good biographies of Fuller that had come out by Joan von Maren, by Paula Blanchard, by Belgel Chavigny, and Charles Capper's book came out while I was working on the Peabody sisters, his first volume of Margaret Fuller. And I thought, everybody knows about Margaret Fuller, but they don't know about the Peabody sisters. And that was the whole reason behind writing this book. And besides which, Margaret Fuller was not very nice to the Peabody sisters, so I thought, to heck with her. But when I finished the book in 2005, Charlie Capper's second volume was not to come out until 2007. I think the first was 1990. I would say, well, I wrote about the Peabody sisters because everybody knows about Margaret Fuller. They don't know about the Peabodys. And people said, well, who's Margaret Fuller? So that was terrible. And then I was given the opportunity to review Charlie's volume 2. This is a 2-volume Margaret Fuller, American Romantic Life, and there's the private years and the public years. And I just found myself falling in love with her all over again. And he had written these 2 volumes, quoting at length from her journals and letters, and her voice was to me suddenly spoke to my feeling then, having been kind of released from the bonds of the Peabody sisters. And so I can't say that I favor her. In fact, I've fallen back in love with Elizabeth Peabody, writing this piece, and I now notice once again that Margaret Fuller wasn't really all that nice to them, but I guess they're all great, and there are plenty more great transcendentalist women to be reading about and learning about, a lot of great scholarship on them. And I'm just going to say, don't read Randall Fuller's Bright Circle because he gets it wrong. So there are other ways to find out about them. He called it Miss Peabody's Caravansary. It's Mrs. Peabody's. That's just one small thing. Oh, sorry. Another question. We can get away from that very quickly.
So you had gone into a really interesting angle of action.
Yes.
As sort of like that being the power. And so I find it very funny that we have author houses here in Concord, to preserve the Alcotts and Emerson and all of that. But Margaret Fuller's house is like a settlement house, essentially, right? And I think what is it, is it the Peabody House? Or
There is, yes, also an
Yeah.
Elizabeth Peabody house. It's not actually a house that she ever lived in, but it's a settlement house that took her name, was once in the West End in Boston, and then has been moved over into Somerville. The Margaret Fuller neighborhood house in Cambridgeport, not too far from MIT and Kendall Square, was actually the house in which she was born and lived till she was 10 or 15, something like that. That is also a settlement house that's become a neighborhood house. Yes, both of these women do have houses of social activism associated with them. So I think that's a very good point.
Yeah,
Thank you.
And I love the point that you had brought up.
Yes.
That like they were actually talking about how action is, what they want their legacy to be, and it has happened.
Yeah. There's also the Fuller Project, which is named for Margaret Fuller for international reporting, and you can look that up online. Mostly reporting on women's lives internationally. So.
Well, thank you very much. Thank you, Megan. Thank you.
And we can have a party downstairs.
Please join us downstairs. We have a reception. We have books for sale and signing, and we can continue our conversation down there.
Thank you very much. Thanks for inviting me.